Hello everyone, and welcome to University Admissions Strategy Redefined, Maximising Innovation and Personalising the Student Experience at Scale, a Times Higher Education webinar in partnership with Salesforce.org. My name is Alistair Lawrence, I'm the Special Projects Editor, and I'll be chairing today's panel. And I'm delighted to be joined by a panel of experts from industry and academia, who are Shane Collins, Director of Student Recruitment and Admissions at the University of Dundee, Rebecca Hollington, Director of UK Recruitment and Partnerships at the University of Wolverhampton, Roisin McAvoy, Head of Admissions at Queen's University, Belfast, Robin Halley, Director of Global Marketing and Student Recruitment at Aberystwyth University, Corey Snow, Director of International Solutions Architecture at Salesforce.org, and Rhys Thomas, Head of Admissions at Royal Central School of Speech and Drama. So admissions is one of the many areas in which higher education has been disrupted by the pandemic. And before we start the panel discussion, I'd like to hand over to Corey Snow, who's going to talk about how Salesforce is working with universities to help them navigate this difficult period. Corey?
Thank you, Alistair. I'm going to share. Alistair, can you confirm that you can see my screen?
Absolutely, yeah, we can see you, Corey.
Excellent. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm Corey Snow, Director of International Solution Architecture at Salesforce.org. I'm delighted to be joining Times Higher Education and our esteemed panelists today to discuss how we can be maximizing innovation and personalizing the student experience at scale, especially as we navigate this next normal. Before we dive into the conversation, I'd like to introduce to those who may not know us, what we do in the education space, and share with you a few insights we have been observing at Salesforce.org. Before we dive into the content, the lawyers require that I remind you to make all purchasing decisions based upon products and services that are currently available, even though I may describe a more glorious future. I'd also like to extend our gratitude for your time and interest today as you all continue to support your students and institutions during the pandemic. We appreciate you taking time away from your busy schedules to go on this journey with us to learn more about what's been happening in the recruitment and admissions space. I'd like to introduce the Education Cloud. There's no other platform that can provide the digital foundation for a connected experience, starting in K through 12 and going into higher education, and ultimately culminating with alumni engagement and fundraising. It's this kind of personalization and one-to-one marketing efforts throughout the student journey that transforms learner engagements into lifelong relationships. The impact of our Education Cloud is pretty incredible. In a recent study we did with Forrester Research, we found that on average, Education Cloud provides 195% return on investment for institutions with just a 7-month payback period. Our solution applies to all of recruitment and admissions, from recruitment to application management to student onboarding. By bringing together data throughout the multiple phases of the enrollment process, Education Cloud provides a team-wide 360-degree view into the full recruitment funnel. And when all your data is in one place, on one integrated system, there's less friction all along the way, which empowers your teams to focus their efforts on what matters most, building meaningful relationships. So let's have a look at Admissionsconnect. Admissionsconnect provides new capabilities purposely designed to empower admissions teams to collaborate more efficiently and enable delightful applicant experiences. Admissionsconnect provides an application reader designed by admissions experts for admissions experts, enabling all participants in the admissions process to see applications and all supporting materials in one place, a single pane of glass. Application management workflow can then be precisely tailored to empower your admissions teams to thrive. Our summer release will include pre-built applicant portals, making it easier than ever to provide a seamless applicant experience. To learn more about Admissionsconnect, visit sfdc.co/admissions-connect. I'm excited to announce that registration is just open for our Education Summit in June. Join us in June. When I was with Harvard University, this was always my favorite event of the year. It's a great way to get to know other people working in education, admissions and recruitment, and technology. Hope to see you there. As we shift to our amazing panel, I'd like to share with you a few themes that we've been hearing from university leaders. The first one is staying connected. Personalized communications create a sense of belonging in a time of physical distancing. Meeting the students where they are in their journey with the information that they need to prosper. The second theme I've been seeing, institutions are embracing the digital experience. Conversation-first technology is becoming the norm. We've seen a 680% increase in the use of conversational technology from last year. Think about chatbots, live agent, WhatsApp. The COVID era has brought forth virtual open days, interactive videos, new advances in virtual reality. The first experience with your institution is likely to be digital. Third theme, engaging lifelong learners. It's become easier for students to find their preferred course wherever they happen to be located. Institutions have had to shift to online learning, which has also opened the door for more international students and lifelong learners to participate regardless of where they're located. And lastly, it's all about the data. Delightful student and staff experiences are fueled by data. Bringing information together empowers institutions with the situational insights to operate more strategically and intelligently. Data is the new oil. And lastly, a big thank you for your attention today. I'm looking forward to the discussion that follows. We have an excellent panel, and I hope everyone will gain some valuable insights. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Corey. That's really helpful. When we there are various things that are impacting on the administrative process for universities at the moment, such as perhaps a shorter summer admissions process that may include post-qualification admissions, concerns about what form A-levels and other assessments will take, uncertainty about travel restrictions for both international and domestic students. These are all among the challenges currently impacting on how universities are managing their admissions process. With that in mind, I'd like to jump straight into the discussion by asking the panel how they have identified the need and also the criteria for a central, reliable process that can handle admissions at their institutions. Rasheen, would you like to go first?
Sure. Well, I think like many universities, the move to a centralized system, it depends on the institution that you're working in. Some of them are far more distributed in terms of the model that they operate with. And I think the more kind of distribution that you have of the admissions process, the more variegated the applicant experience is. And that's much harder to kind of quality assure or control to make sure that there's a comparability of the applicant experience. So really, in my current institution and in my former institution at Ulster University, the two universities in Northern Ireland, one of the things that we've recognised is that centralisation piece, and the one door that opens for all applicants is a really critical part of managing the applicant experience, because applicants are making judgments about the student experience they're going to have with every interaction that they have. And often the admissions team, or certainly the recruitment into the admissions team, is the first meaningful engagement that a lot of them have had with university life. So it becomes a kind of an indicator of what the experience will be like thereafter. And when there's a lot of choice, even for full-time undergraduates who have had no prior experience of university, with having 5 choices, that decision-making is going on throughout the journey. So certainly in my experience, the centralized approach where you can quality assure, manage, get that comparable applicant experience that very much chimes with the values of the institution is absolutely critical to that first impression, and then seeing that through.
Right, thank you very much. Reece, can I come to you next? Because I'm interested with Central being a specialist school. Are you dealing with different challenges, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly as a smaller admissions team, perhaps than other institutions represented here today, I would say that the admissions team are perhaps required to know a bit more about sort of broader, you know, a wider range of topics. So, you know, things like student finance and international and things like that, whereas certain other institutions might have admissions teams who are just admissions processing and that kind of thing. But equally, I think colleagues from outside the admissions team, you know, are expected to know about admissions processes themselves, so that they can advise and signpost as well accordingly. So the process needs to function well and reliably, so that anyone jumping in at any stage can advise appropriately on the next steps in terms of you know, information requirements and so on of the applicant. But I think I would, just to add to what Rasheen was saying, I don't think I could say hand on heart that I think there is one single central process for admissions, because it really depends on like Rasheen was saying, the student, what they're applying for. Even in a small institution like Central, we've got you know, a wide range of courses. And what point they're applying as well. You know, if they're applying with, you know, using APAL as an example, that process is going to be different to someone coming straight from school. If they're an international student, they've got additional requirements as well. So I think the important thing is that everyone involved knows the differences, and at what point the applicant is at.
Okay, thanks. For Central, are there applications that involve a practical component, or is that, and how's that being managed with lockdown and remote learning?
Yeah, absolutely. So we audition for the performance courses. We will audition all of the applicants. Obviously this year that's not been possible. We would normally do it on site at Central, or we would do regional auditions, or we would even travel internationally, but this year that's just not been possible, obviously. So we've done everything via Zoom, which has its pros and cons. You know, we were able to get through a higher volume of first stage auditions more quickly. So that obviously helps us in some ways, but the communication element perhaps is something that could be improved upon, because it's something we sort of fell into last year as opposed to sort of planning it properly.
I see. Okay, thank you. Robin, I'd like to ask you how the admissions process is changing at Aberystwyth, and are there elements that you've digitized or kept the same? Have there been some things that you've been easier to alter than others?
Yeah, I mean, if I could just go back before I answer that, just to one of the key points from my perspective that Rasheen brought up. I think it's really the reputational area that I'm most interested in, or one of the areas that I'm most interested in, because no student ever says that, say, the Department of Disney Studies responded slowly to you. They always say that the university. So having it centralized allows you to control that. And I think that's absolutely critical now, especially as we get into multiple admission cycles, because, and I think we'll talk about post-qualification admissions, but I think those multiple admission cycles already exist because of international students and people like that coming in. So it's not just A levels. I mean, we're in a peculiar situation in the sense that we're halfway through a project where we're bringing in a completely new CRM system, and we've brought in the marketing and student recruitment parts. I think the bit that we struggle with most of all is that even where it's not one office dealing with everything, it should look to the outside world as if it's one group of people dealing with everything. And I think all universities suffer a little bit from passing things between different people, which I don't understand. I understand that it may not be a one-stop shop, but to a student, it should feel like a one-stop shop from their initial inquiry through to admission. And I think that's something the universities perhaps struggle with for legacy reasons as much as anything, because I mean, there are some universities on this panel that up until very recently would have regarded themselves as being selecting universities, and they've still got a little bit of a hangover of, dare I say, keeping people out rather than encouraging people in.
Okay, thank you very much. Rebecca, would you like to add to this? I mean, what's the centralising looking like at Wolverhampton?
I think it's more about the consistency of the admissions processes and the consistency of approach to admissions at the university, which has really been more of a key for us, and that's really to impact in kind of two areas. It's around the applicant journey, and actually exactly what Robin was saying, from the outside looking in, you are applying to the university of X, Y, and Z, and from an applicant's perspective, it should look consistent regardless of how you behave and how you handle that application internally. And it's through that entire student journey as well. So once they've applied, how long does it take? What does the decision look like? So you've got some institutions in the past and some potentially still who use contextual offers in one way with certain subjects and then use them in a different way with different subject areas, and that can become very confusing for applicants, especially if they've applied to more than one course within the same institution. I think that becomes quite telling if they find that it's quite variable, the experience that they're getting. But also I think in terms of consistency internally as well, in terms of us being able to manage exactly where students are in the cycle and project where we may or may not end up come middling end of cycle as well. And that's obviously becoming more complex with all the different submission cycles that are running, and we have multiple starts at the university as well. So I think it's really more around consistency of the admissions approaches and the admissions practices that you're employing within the institution, and then just refining those as you move forward, and just realizing that actually for us admissions is one element of that student journey, but from a student's perspective, admissions is the integral part of that student journey for them to become a student at the university. And like Rasheen was saying, it's the first stage really where they can compare absolutely between the different institutions that they're applying to. Up until that point, they interact with different institutions in different ways. Once they apply, it's almost a benchmark of, okay, and from here on in, I've applied to 5 institutions all at the same time. How are they going to manage my application for the next 3, 4, 5 months or 1 month, if it's PQO? So I think it's really important that there's that consistent approach from the university's perspectives.
Great, thank you. Shane, Rasheen, go ahead.
So I just want to pick up on a point that Robin was making around selection. I think that all universities to a greater or lesser degree recruit, but also in some cases select. And certainly if you have medicine or dentistry, nursing, teaching, allied health professional programs, Scotland and Northern Ireland both work in number controlled environments. So, we are kind of beholden to those numbers for our home students, and that's where selection still plays a hand. So whatever kind of platform that you're using, the communications to applicants around clarity with regard to the selection process, why you've chosen that, why it's proportionate, why it gives you the additional information that you need beyond what you've captured in their application, is all really critical. And then it's about managing the turnaround times with that, and the ranking order that you need to employ in order to control your number, because it gives you a gathered field. Certainly in Northern Ireland, we have a net undersupply of places of university compared to applicants. And I know that that's the same in Scotland to a lesser degree. So there's a variegated landscape across the 4 nations as well, certainly with regard to undergraduate recruitment and selection. And I guess you need systems that can accommodate all those different modes that we're in simultaneously when you're abroad. When you have a broad curriculum offering, like most of the universities here do.
Great, thank you. Shane, I'd like to come to you next if I can, just to ask about how the second year of planning for an admission cycle with a partially opened or a lockdown campus is starting to look at Dundee, particularly when you have other factors in play in Scotland, like number controls and the undersupply that Rasheen mentioned.
I would certainly echo Roisin's comments about the variegated landscape, and that's absolutely true for us in Scotland. I think we will all be proud of the student experience that our students have in our universities. And I think one point I would want to make around this is that the customer experience pre-registration is a really important signal to our applicants about the kind of student experience they're going to get. And I think Rebecca said a bit about that too. So we're a university that has a highly centralized approach to admissions. Riz touched on the fact that there are different modes of selection, and as well as having a mixed economy in terms of funding for our applicants, we have interviewing subjects, non-interviewing subjects, portfolio subjects, non-portfolio subjects, etc. So I agree that there can't be one single process, but you can nonetheless find themes and core processes that can be applied across the board. So to your question, Alistair, about what it looks like now in year 2, I think whatever the technology you're using, what's important is that you're planning out what messaging your applicants need and when, and that phasing of messaging to them. So thinking back to what one of my colleagues noted, who they want to speak to and when. So in this second year, I'm sure the question we're all working on, and most of the people on the call today are working on, is what will study look like next year? So right now, that messaging is really, really important. But in thinking about central processes, I think one potential pitfall of a central process is if that central process operates in a vacuum. So our job collectively is to have a central process that brings us the benefits of a consistent experience, one that reduces bias, one where we have good data gathering, for example, but that is extremely well connected to our academic community, so that academic engagement with the way we select stays live, but also that is very engaged with frankly, changing messages through a year like this, where the message has to change. The other element to a central process, I think, is that there is, as Robin touched on, there's selection and there's recruitment, and we're all engaged in both to some extent. And it would be a bad outcome if your central process meant that applicants, for example, didn't get to speak to academic colleagues. So we need to have central processes that actually pull in the different elements of our university. So I think that's even more true now in this second year of the pandemic, because the messages we're delivering to our applicants, particularly international applicants, are quite complex and are changing, and to some extent involve messages like wait and see. We're going to have to see what the legislative landscape or the guidance looks like in the autumn. And because that's complex, central control over the messaging is actually very helpful, and means that you can, again, be consistent for the customer.
Great, thank you very much. Corey, Salesforce works with about 60 universities in the UK. I think I'm right in saying, does this tally with the overall conversations that you're having with universities that you partner with? We've heard a lot about the importance of admissions as a benchmarking tool for students, but also the need for them to reduce bias, gather quality data, be able to be very agile in their messaging because of the different cohorts that are being affected by all of this, particularly internationalization. Are these some of the challenges that you're trying to address?
I love some of the themes today. As Rebecca and Shane mentioned, those first impressions really matter and create a sense of belonging from the start. And it's very difficult to undo a sort of bad first impression. And I enjoyed Rob's theme about how the institution should appear to the outside world. There's an old adage that says, don't ship your org chart. And this is the idea of, while your organization may be fragmented into departments and hierarchies, to an end customer or a student, these things just don't matter to their success. And I think we're often pretty good at exposing to the outward world how we're structured internally. And then there's another adage. This one came from the CIO at University of Michigan when I was out visiting before the pandemic. Don't ship your systems architecture, which as an architect is kind of close to my heart. Often the systems model the organization, and then create this experience where there are a lot of seams between systems, and applicants might have to move from one system to another. And it all has to do with the way that the institution is organized. But we have the technology to provide one unified external view, regardless of how complex the internal organization or the internal systems are. And this is a big trend today with this idea of creating a composite something called composite applications that sit on top of all of the legacy systems, but exposed to the outward world. A single view, something that's tailored and personalized to their needs, and enabling those applicants to be more successful, both in making a good selection, but then in navigating the process more seamlessly and in a tailored way. So I think there is a possibility of having the best of both worlds, where you can create that unified experience, even if you have a more federated model inside your institution, and then unite all of those sort of intake streams into one experience that's tailored for each cohort.
Okay, thanks. To that point about personalizing the student experience, how much of this is a conversation that you're starting to have with your colleagues more and more? I mean, Rebecca, you spoke about having different admission cycles and different types of students coming through. How much are you having to personalize different student experiences alongside that?
A lot is probably the simplest answer. And I think it's interesting because it hasn't necessarily, we've always looked at student demographics and student personas and trying to group student personas as much as possible in terms of interests, barriers, motivations, challenges, so that we can start to talk to students in the right way, with the right channel, at the right time, with the right voice, with the right content. But also there's almost micro segments within that, in terms of, you take something like nursing, for example, and you can't necessarily talk to all nurses in the same way. You've really got to fragment those demographics within those who are school and college leavers, who might be coming out of career changes. They might be doing enhanced training for CPD. So the same course doesn't serve the same purpose for the same group of students. So we've really had to start to unpick exactly what those characteristics of students look like, and try to group them where we possibly can, and then deliver a tailored youth student journey really through that entirety. And within that, we include the admissions piece. So what Reese was saying earlier, in terms of, if you can try, we each need to go through certain stages of the admissions process, but it might look slightly different if they have to kind of segue and do an interview, or segue and do a portfolio. The way in which you communicate that they have to do an interview will be different depending on what background that student's come from, the journey they've already taken to get to the stage of apply as well. And you've got to start to take that into consideration. It's hugely complex. And also there's a balance between asking too much of your students to find out too much at the start, versus knowing enough to make sure that you're helping them and helping them progress in the right way as well. And I think from that, you can start to generalize exactly, how you think a student of this demographic for this course will think and feel and behave, but then also just make sure that you're listening off the back of that as well. And I think we've got much better as a sector in the last 12 months at listening to students and understanding exactly how students are thinking and feeling. But I think a lot of that has come off the back of needing to almost start from scratch, because we're in such uncharted territory. So it's been, positives of that over the last year, I think. So a huge amount of kind of nuanced support is needed for those students, and actually understanding how they want to be kind of engaged with as well.
Great, thank you very much. Rob, I was wondering if I can ask you, you mentioned about the sort of the selection process alongside the admissions process, and the fact that you're onboarding a new system as well. It seems like you're perhaps dealing with a double challenge at Aberystwyth, if you're changing your systems, but you're also you're having to adapt to constantly changing circumstances around the admissions process.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. We introduced veterinary science last year as a subject, and obviously it works on its own timetable. Anyone with medical schools knows about that timetable. And running that as an institution at the same time as, frankly, we were clearing up from clearing or late recruitment was really quite an experience. We do suffer with that. I think the other one that needs to be taken into account, and again, if we're talking about PQA, this may become a slightly different need for people coming from overseas, international students, and the different rhythms that accompany recruitment there. And I think those may become much more apparent in the future, where we're dealing not just with the 4 nations in the UK recruiting, but also internationally.
Thank you. Sorry. Shane, I just wanted to ask you also about you mentioned how the messaging is changing around this. So in addition to the challenges that Rebecca and Rob both outlined, how much extra work is it to really sort of find the tone of voice and find the appropriate timescales to manage expectations with students at the moment?
I think just in terms of the culture shift that we've all been through in the last 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, the thinking around what our role in communicating with inquirers and applicants has changed a lot. So, as Rebecca and Robin both noted, the kind of differentiation of the audience and what they need to hear is really important. So, for example, how do you ensure that people do answer questions about their ethnicity, for example, or a disability, and to make sure that people respond positively and understand why we're asking questions like that. So I think that all of us will be doing a lot more thinking in that space than we ever would have done 5 years ago plus. The other cultural element for me is that, when you think about a central system, again, you will have multiple groups across the institution eventually communicating with the applicant right through to registration and beyond. And so the systems can enable that, but they don't solve the problem for you. And actually what matters is the culture within the institution around staying connected. And you can't but have some moments of handoff. So in terms of getting the messaging right, there's something around planning who's going to focus on which aspects of the message with your inquirers and applicants at the right point in the process. So we tend to think about our kind of central corporate communications as having a particular purpose, then some direct engagement through social media groups, or the kind of individual direct conversations you can have with applicants, but then also when is that right moment for academic contact to commence, and that's been a big piece of work for us, particularly with international applicants. So is there more work there? Absolutely. I think it's a huge part of what we're all thinking about, and I think it reflects the fact that we increasingly value the fact that our applicants have a really, really good experience with us, and that's why we're doing so much thinking.
Okay, great, thank you. Rhys, I'd like to come to you next if I could, to pick up on a couple of things, partly those points that Shane was talking about managing expectations, and also thought Robin's point about onboarding a new discipline during this period as being a challenge. You're adjacent to one of the hardest hit industries affected by the pandemic. Is that having to change how you look at the amount of students that you're onboarding, or is it changing the number of applications you're getting? Is it changing, how you're starting to look at more sort of handing off on the end of the student journey with, post qualification work?
Yeah, I think we're certainly seeing, I think like a number of other places, that undergraduate students are thinking a little bit more about where they want to apply, leaving it a little bit later to make their sort of final decisions. We've not seen any sort of detrimental impact in terms of postgraduate applications. In fact, I think a lot of people are taking the opportunity to sort of, they've had this dream of being a stenographer or something for years, and now they're jumping on the course while they've got the opportunity, while they're out of work. So it's interesting to see the difference between postgrad and undergraduate in that sense. I think for us, it's been very, as a smaller team in particular, it's been, so the challenge has been to manage expectations, as you were saying. I think I recently saw a video. I think the speaker was Simon Sinek, was talking about sort of millennials onward, people born from 1984 onwards, and in terms of expectations and this sort of instant gratification sort of generation, where you can hop onto Amazon if you're shopping and you can get something delivered the next day. If you want to watch a TV series, you can binge watch the whole thing on Netflix, within a day. And it's a generation that is used to that sort of instant sort of feedback, that likes as soon as they upload a photo on Facebook or Instagram or what have you. So for us, dealing with that expectation over the course of the pandemic, with a massive increase in questions via email because people just aren't able to visit us as they would normally. That has been quite a challenge to deal with, like I say, with a small team. It has required us introducing new ways of working, moving away from our sort of reliance on paper-based systems where there was maybe previously reluctance to do that with certain colleagues. They've had to do it now, so no choice. But it's, yeah, paper-based isn't going to cut it with this generation of students. I think when I started at Central 6 months ago, I looked at all the processes and saw, you know, where there was room for improvement. But I think, yeah, the important thing is managing expectations, and I think students are quite reasonable if you say to them, look, you know, this is a small team. There is only you know, 3 or 4 of us. Rather than signing off emails from the admissions team or the university, you sign off with a personal sort of greeting. Then I think people realize, okay, there's a person there, and you know, it's only one person, and they're, yeah, like I say, they're very reasonable.
Great, thank you very much. Rasheen, to that point about managing expectations and external pressures, is there almost a separate challenge of finding out the support that different students need for different reasons? Shane previously spoke about finding the best way to phrase questions in order to be inclusive and constructive when you're managing special requirements and things like that. Are those some of the challenges that you're dealing with too?
Well, there are a whole other group of stakeholders that are out there as well, which include advisors for students, particularly in schools. There are those people who work in the colleges for alternative level 3 qualifications. There are lecturers or studies advisors for people who are applying for postgraduate study. And it's really understanding that they're part of your audience too, and kind of building those channels of communication with them, because they are influencers. They are often influencing the decisions that applicants are making. So it's being able to kind of map who they are, and being able to ensure that consistency of messaging with them that's appropriate. I agree that as our intakes become more diverse, which I think is a very good thing, it's part of the civic mission of a university, we too have to respond appropriately. You know, that kind of single approach just doesn't work anymore. I think that people are so saturated in a social media world that they expect, as Reese was saying, you know, they expect that instant kind of acknowledgement, at least, and some kind of managing of expectations around timelines, and that keeping engaged. And that can get really exhausting if you're trying to use your old ways of doing things in what is, I think, probably a new world, certainly post-pandemic. And so we need the tools and the infrastructure, or the architecture, as Corey was saying, to facilitate us in that regard. The other thing for me that's really critical, we've talked a lot about the applicant experience and stakeholders. The staff experience is absolutely crucial in all of this. I really care about my staff, and I've seen how hard they've worked. And I mean, they really brought it last year to a point where it didn't feel good. My job this year is to make sure that it's less cruel in that regard. And I think that's probably replicated across the sector. I think Reese has kind of touched on it, maybe in a more diplomatic fashion. But I mean, when you're dealing with volume, like we do get, and you're wanting to really be responsive to applicants, to kind of signpost that journey for them, the people who are doing that, and often doing it without the tools they need, are the admissions teams. So for me, anything that can facilitate a really good staff experience, so that when your staff decide to leave for a career progression opportunity, it's the hardest decision they've ever made, rather than the first opportunity that came their way, then I will know that something good has happened.
Great, thank you. I assure you that staff experience wasn't on our list of things to talk about, so that's given us the perfect segue to jump in on that. Because Corey, I see you've got your hand raised. Would you like to tell us a little bit about sort of the support for staff that you build into when you're putting together the platform?
Yeah, I really like Rashid's themes. It really takes a village to bring in an applicant, there are so many different people participating in the entire experience and the entire workflow. And I think it's really important, you're mentioning the school advisors, for example. And we're hearing a lot from international students how much of a role that these sort of third-party agents that might be located in their own home country, how much they play a role in the process, in the selection process. And the families play a role, and the parents play a role. And really the ability to bring forth this entire support network and this entire community together is what makes it possible for applicants to thrive, to make good choices up front, and to have a really great experience, because every one of these touch points matters so much. So I love these themes. And then, also while these things are largely cultural, they have a lot to do with the personal touch. And Reese talked about, making it personal, because ultimately it is personal. There are humans behind all of this. I think that it's on us as technologists to make the technology disappear in a way, and enable these entire experiences to actually be more human. So making the teams more efficient, so that the technology is not in the way. And the internal staff experience is a big part of that, enabling folks to focus on what really matters, building those one-on-one connections. So that's one of the things that we can aspire for as technologists, to actually make the technology disappear.
Great, thank you. Robin, I wanted to ask you about the conversations with staff around building your own new architecture. And what did has that been an ongoing process of getting feedback from colleagues, or was it something that was audited before you started? How did it work?
No, it was something that we had a very, very lengthy, but appropriately lengthy consultation that was across the institution. It was not simply the people within marketing, student recruitment, admissions. It involved stakeholders across the institution. And I think, we're only halfway through the implementation, but I think that we pretty much got the consultation right. We might not have got everything right afterwards, but we got the consultation right. Just picking up on one of the other things, because I think the staff engagement thing and the staff experience is incredibly important. I think the flip side of it, and I think in a mass higher education system is quite an interesting one, is this fact that we're dealing with something which is really special to individuals. And that if you're dealing in a mass higher education system, you can almost forget how important it is to the individual. And I think the technology we were looking at was really to make sure that we can get that feeling, that individuality for students, so that they feel at every stage that they're accomplishing something. And I think that's important to remember as well.
Great, thank you. Shane, I can see you nodding in agreement. Is this something that you're cognizant of when you're putting together your systems for recruiting and selecting?
Yes, absolutely. Again, I think something of the personality of the institution wants to come through in the kind of the corporate comms that you have to have, but then eventually you want them to have those personal interactions. I saw a question coming through from our audience today about when should academics be involved, and I've been thinking about that since that came up. And I think when you want it is right through. You definitely want very strong academic engagement in, for example, establishing selection criteria and in kind of enabling that process. But in terms of the academic conversation with applicants, our goal is to try and make sure that they're high quality conversations. So we tend to think about having those a little bit later in the process, so that the volume is lower and that those conversations can be more meaningful. Another thing I've been thinking about, just in relation to what colleagues have been saying, is around the information that we publish in advance. Again, it seems an obvious point, but before the applicants actually start speaking to us, we want to have as clear information as possible so that they don't have to ask certain questions. And a problem we've been thinking about a lot is how we learn from the questions that they do ask. So I know Corey, talked about data and using data. We don't have perfect systems, and we've a year and a half ahead of us of implementing paperless admissions more fully, and we've just launched an agent portal. And so one of the things we're doing a lot of thinking about is, from those inquiries that come through to us from applicants, how can we learn from them effectively so that we change our public information, for example, and be more responsive. I'm not sure anybody's got that fully right, but there's something there about marrying, the quantitative data that we get in conversion rates, etc., with the qualitative around what types of questions we're getting.
Okay, yeah, it's certainly an emerging field that more and more people want to talk about. Rebecca, to that end, what does the data management process look like? You previously talked about a very complex system that had all different types of cohorts and different types of start dates. Is gathering data around all of that particularly challenging?
It is, yeah. So obviously, I mean, we're quite lucky at Wolverhampton where we do have an established CRM system, and it does talk well to our admissions system, which I know is probably the holy grail. It doesn't talk well all the time, so please don't get too jealous. There are challenges with it, and I think actually the challenges are going to become more so when we start to move to an admission system potentially that is a little bit shorter, where the key, status changes are very much, either closer together or less so. If you don't get a conditional offer or an unconditional offer, you just get an offer and that's it. I think where the statuses aren't absolute, that's where I think CRM systems are going to struggle to start to talk to more of kind of the free text fields within an admission system, if that makes sense. So I think that's going to be quite complicated. But from a data capture perspective for us, we really lean quite heavily on our CRM system, but we were very careful to make sure that the CRM system is a complementary system to our actual student journey processes and approach. And I think sometimes we start from the wrong way around, and it's quite interesting. We've had a bit of a shift recently at the university in terms of how we want to approach contextual admissions. And what we did was we sat down, we approached it from the student perspective, and this is what we need to achieve. And then it was how are we going to do it? And I think that having been a second conversation, probably, it does frustrate staff, because I think it's almost, we can't do it exactly how we'd like to do it. But I think if you start with the system and you're constrained by systems rather than starting with what's best for the student, you end up losing view of the student being the main person that you're trying to engage with. And I think that's where you need to start with the data as well, is in terms of what data do you need to know at certain points of the student journey to really enhance that student's experience at the right points, to serve them the right information at the right time, and also to make sure you learn from that as well. And I think it was a really interesting point that Shane made about learning from some of the qualitative information that's coming out of how your students are interacting with the university, because we make sure at Wolverhampton that our inquiries team sit on a lot of our working groups. So we have a representative from our inquiries team, because they're the ones that speak to students every single day, literally from right first point of contact all the way through to enrolment. There aren't really any other team that sits across the entire student journey all the time, every day, and just making sure that they input the behaviour and the sentiments of the students and what they're asking. So again, every time we discuss what data we're capturing, how we're using systems, how we're approaching some of our processes for admissions, interviews, etc., that we're keeping the students' experience at the core of that, and making sure that that's what we're focusing on. So yeah.
Okay, thank you, Rebecca. Roisin, I wanted to ask you about that, but also a point you made earlier about the initial pressure that was placed upon the department by having to change the way it worked in such a fundamental way. We've talked now about reducing the length of the admissions window over the summer and other things that may be brought to bear on the sector. Do you currently have a system that you feel could comfortably withstand that pressure, or is it almost like an unreasonable expectation to ask universities to do the same job in less time this summer?
That's a good question. I mean, we did it. So we know, I mean, last year was kind of the classic stress test environment. Where we really did effectively 3 cycles in one, an undergraduate. We also introduced postgrad entry in January, which we don't normally have. And all of these things overlapped. And if you take account of sort of the CAS issuance process and the kind of the additional burden of work that creates for an admissions team, it really did feel like a perfect storm. And I guess really, we talk about agility and lean systems and what have you. The team had to be very agile and very lean. And we now are really we're kind of in that phase of looking now for a system that will support us better in kind of facilitating some of the ambitions that have been held for a while, but this has definitely been kind of pushed on by the experience of working in the pandemic. And I think just the general volatility that we experience in the sector. I mean, okay, nobody could have imagined a pandemic, but it feels like things have become more disrupted over time. We don't know how the PQ admissions consultation will play out, the impact that will have, whether international will be in scope or out of scope, but I agree with Robin, regardless, it's going to have an impact. Just that greater diversity that we respond to, which is, you know, in some ways it's a good thing because it means that UK higher education is still a destination of choice internationally for a lot of our students. And that's good for our home students as well to internationalise their learning experience. That's a really critical part of a higher education experience. But anything like Corey was saying, where you can make the technology almost invisible, but it's doing everything that it needs to do in order to expedite the process and to facilitate those interactions in a seamless and intuitive way. And, you know, admissions is one of the first places where people say no as well, because not everybody that applies, unfortunately, gets what they want. And sometimes that's because they're not ready, you know, the maxim of don't set people up to fail. And sometimes it's because there was competition around supply and demand, and we weren't able to give the person what they wanted this time around. So there's something around those communications where you inevitably are disappointing people, but you're also encouraging them to make good on whatever deficit that there is, to help them understand there's a different way to get the same outcome. You know, I think clearing is really important, and I think PQ admissions is probably trying to do this writ large, because it's the point in time where people really need to think very clearly in a very focused time frame and a focused way around, okay, what now? Because what I wanted hasn't played out for whatever reason. And anything that we can do to facilitate really good, well-informed decision-making, because Robin's right, this is a really important decision that people are making, particularly those school leavers who maybe, for them, it's the first time they ever enter into a contract, a meaningful contract. It's the path that then takes them to whatever vocation they want to go and explore further. So really good informed decision-making based on reliable information, a system that's kind of transparent and accountable, where places are verified. As Shane was saying, you need to look at your bias and how do you minimize it? How do you at least go, okay, that's a place where it's possible. What are we trying to do to mitigate it? Clarity around contextualized admission making or widening participation policies. Someone in the Q&A had said about the variegated landscape around level 3 qualifications and how that makes our job harder. I can't imagine a world where that will go away. I think if anything, the fracturing will probably become greater rather than lesser. So how do you benchmark the equivalences and the kind of the fairness piece? How do you ensure fairness in a context of diversity where you're still being inclusive and transparent and you're explaining it to people? So there's an awful lot of quite complicated ideas that you need to simplify and package in a way that people can understand. You know, all of those things are going on. And, you know, the pandemic in many ways has just shone a light in places that we were too busy to look at before. And I think that's certainly been the case for UK higher education and in that admissions and recruitment space as well.
Great, thank you very much, Shane. Come to you next.
I wanted to echo something Roisin said there about some of the complexity for the applicants. In Scotland, there are, the Scottish universities have been working together through University of Scotland around a number of issues, particularly in the access space. And I can see a few colleagues on the wider call today who are in that group. And one of the things that comes up over and over again is the language that we as universities use. And if you're an applicant, whether you're international or UK, the reality is all of us in universities speak in slightly different ways. We refer to things slightly differently. At Dundee, we talk about matriculation. Other universities talk about registration. And that in itself creates a challenge. So in Scotland, we've been trying to work together to unify our language to some extent around some key important concepts. And I think that will help. But actually, frankly, as a group of universities across the UK, we have a long way to go on that. Make that easy for applicants who are looking at multiple universities.
Great, thank you very much. I think it's important to note these things. Also, I thought it was interesting what Roisin said was one of the calls for standardization in terms of assessment is actually probably going to get more complex rather than more standardized going forward. We've got about 5 minutes left. We haven't had a much time to talk about postgraduate qualification. I don't think we're probably going to be able to squeeze that in, but one thing I would like to put to the panel is just a question about future proofing. Obviously, I appreciate that there's a huge amount of uncertainty ahead, but on the whole, is there any criteria or anything that you think is perhaps the most important thing for building a robust admissions system that people really need to keep at the front of their mind in order to give themselves the best chance of success? Rhys, are you? Right, I've just been thinking out loud. Go ahead.
I think transparency is probably the main thing for me. I think it's important to be able to explain to applicants why we're asking certain things of them, what certain information will be used for. Not that we have to explain it every single time, but if they ask, we need to be able to explain convincingly to them why we're requesting certain data, certain information, why we're asking them to go through certain processes. For us, for instance, we might want to explain why we have 3 rounds of auditions. So I think transparency in any system is absolutely key. You hear of horror stories of people not putting details of their disabilities on their application because they think that will negatively affect their chances of getting on a course, when actually it's there so that we can make reasonable adjustments if we need to, if they get onto the course. So it's affecting them by not putting it on. So communicating the smaller things like that to applicants and making sure that the process is as transparent and as simple as has been said previously as possible for the applicant. We might be running around like headless chickens in the background, but as long as the applicant is calm and happy with the process, then I think that's the important thing.
Okay, great, thank you. I just wanted to squeeze in one other point, which is to ask about building in a provision for lifelong learning and alumni engagement into the admissions process, and whether that's something that comes into play later, or is it something that will just, do you think, evolve naturally over time because of the way that the requirements for universities to offer different types of courses is changing, and an increased pressure from the government in the UK anyway on upskilling and reskilling and things like that?
Is that directed at me again? Sorry.
If you've got a thought, go ahead, please. I've left your mic on for too long, but no, it's
sorry. I think that's something that will sort of evolve as we go along. I think a lot of places have got very strong connections with their alumni. I know that Aberystwyth is still sending me things sort of 10 years on. So I think it might be something that is dealt with more pre-application. So in terms of sort of careers guidance and that kind of thing, people will look at a broader range of qualifications rather than just being funneled straight into university. But yeah, I think that's likely to develop as we go along.
Okay, great, thanks. Robert, it sounds like you've got quite a robust system in place, if Rhys is still hearing from you colleagues, but have you got anything to add along those lines?
Yeah, no, as you might have guessed, I've got a bit of a bias towards international, as that's my background. And I think that one of the things that we're likely to see within the UK is an implementation of some of the things that we've done quite successfully internationally. And I think that internationally, we've been more engaged with students, with alumni for student recruitment purposes than perhaps we have been in the UK. And I hope that we'll bring some of the good practice that we've had internationally across the UK space.
Brilliant, thank you very much. I think, Roisin, we've just got time for one more if you'd like to add to that. Yeah.
I think that the key thing here, just keeping in mind platforms to facilitate it, if you have an end-to-end CRM or equivalent that actually captures all your interactions at that kind of pre-applicant phase, the inquiry prospecting phase, the applicant journey through the student life cycle and into alumni. You have a group of people there who potentially will want to come back to you as postgraduates for CPD opportunities and, as you say, lifelong learning. And actually that's the beauty of having a single system, as Corey was saying, and universities, because of their nature, they can be very distributed in the way in which procurement operates, you know, different platforms and different faculties or even schools. Actually bringing something together that allows you to capture that entire student life cycle creates rich opportunities as you come back again. And I'm really interested in that at the moment as we think about what we're going to do next.
Great, thank you very much. I think that brings us up to time quite neatly, so it's a good point to end on. We're looking to the future. I'd like to thank everyone in the panel for joining me today: Robin, Roisin, Shane, Rebecca, Reese and Corey. I think we've got through quite a lot in an hour. It's been very informative. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have. And I'd like to thank everyone in the audience for joining us too. There will be an on-demand version of this recording made available on the Times Higher Education website, along with a summary article. So please feel free to catch up with us post-event or distribute it to colleagues as needed. Thank you all very much.